So it's left to me to tell Venom's final story. This is a very long tale, I should warn you. This is the story of how an immortal symbiote theoretically self-destructed for the sake of all mortal life he loved, or rather all biological life forms he loved. First, for the sake of drama, let's travel a bit into the future, to the ultimate final battle of our old favorite. Let's go cosmic, shall we? This is the last battle of synthetic life against the conglomerate called the Mind of God, a battle of cosmic proportions, but let's go back a bit, a few trillion years ago when the Venom symbiote was one of many, each a living direct test, separated from the hive mind of the clients. Each symbiote required a biological host to anchor itself in this moment of space-time, but only Venom developed a true love for organic life after bonding with its host, Eddie Brock. I never truly understood what he saw in Eddie, but hey, I'm not a symbiote. An important note here, the encoded DNA of each host was stored in genetic codexes, woven through the dimensional mantle of the symbiote's body. This database was almost infinite, a capacity that would prove important in the distant years to come, because during its first steps through the golden age of human superheroes, the symbiote virtually bonded with thousands of organic life forms, from humans to mutants and even countless alien species. However, every attempt at lasting symbiosis inevitably failed. The immortal symbiote could miraculously heal any short-term damage, but the long-term biological damage to DNA, that was a kind of damage that the arrow of time could not undo. Eddie Brock, inexplicably favored by the symbiote, would become the human host who lived the longest, whether he wanted that life or not. Through the decades and then through the centuries, Eddie's aging organs began to be replaced by symbiotic versions. Under the crushing pressure of time, he began to decay, simply becoming a shell filled with cells created by the symbiote. The grotesquely elongated final act took place in Eddie's deteriorated being. Symbiotic cells began to replace each of his neurons one by one, narrowing his tentacles, simulating the connections of identical actions, and even as the golden age of the superorganism collapsed into a robotic genocide of apocalyptic proportions and then into a galactic extinction event, Venom fought hard to buy his host new time. Another year, and then another month, and then another week, or another minute, another second, but he realized less that the human brain could not function being only an organic fraction surrounded by a sea of imposters. Ed's personality and his memory core began to disintegrate, becoming a mix of symbiotic substitutes. His memories began to be inhabited by symbiotic duplicates, each trying to fill the gaps in Eddie's collapsing memory. But it made no sense to keep a flickering light in Eddie's mind, bearing in mind that every Clinton symbiote was born from the living abyss, each one forming part of a hive, an emerging consciousness. By this point, something like this had already been seen, but the golden age of superheroes had ended, and now, finally, after a long time, Eddie was also gently coming to remove all his symbiotic organisms from him and wished his beloved host to die with it. The last human on Earth turned to dust under the bright moon, composed of trillions of nanomachines. At this point, you might start to wonder what that was about a robbery apocalypse and a galactic-scale extinction event. For millennia, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction had prevented biocultures from unleashing artificial intelligence as a weapon, until the moment when, according to the records we have of the war, the cliques that were losing released the locks that kept the supreme intelligence from becoming genuinely supreme as a countermeasure. First the Yays, and then a dozen technological powers released their own machines out to evolve and surpass the artificial intelligence of the cliques, and boom, the arms race of artificial intelligence began, like a storm of self-replicating metal robots. Thousands of life masses would be annihilated as nanobots consumed every piece of matter, one star at a time, and turned that mass into enhanced forms of themselves, until the Milky Way was filled with billions of brains the size of planets, each one being a collective of artificial intelligence. Whole milks were transformed into areas where no biological life was allowed, while an infinity of artificial intelligences fought among themselves for domination. Among them, there was one that was especially tenacious, descended from the consciousness of a human, with a digitally programmed mind based on the brain of the Golden Age technologist, the selfish and hedonistic Tony Stark. During this time of cyber-Darwinism, the intelligence based on being began to assimilate how much biological mass would be found in its path, but in the meantime, it was not impressed by the efforts of the intelligence of being to assimilate the universe. He was concerned with his own attempts to save his mortal hosts, The symbiote also had copies of each of the personalities and memories of its hosts programmed into its codices. But for Venom, a virtual ghost of Eddie was simply not just a form made of flesh and bone. He could portray Eddie's imperfection, nothing more and nothing less, since this biological ghost was nothing more and nothing less than a deception. So, while swarms of artificial intelligence fought around the Milky Way, all surviving symbiotes used biological hosts to retreat to safe areas of space. However, among all of them, Venom did not stand alone, as he had programmed a long-term plan. Unfortunately, his plan required the cooperation of the other symbiotes, but whether first-generation symbiotes or descendants of the fractured Clinton mind, all these symbiotes were selfish and had psychopathic tendencies that did not allow them any kind of collaboration. These guys were not team players, and it was here that the symbiote war began, a war that sought the unification of all. War was what symbiotes were good at, uniting, not so much. But he couldn't convince the other symbiotes to preserve their hosts, let alone to join and fight against the artificial intelligences. Clearly, the symbiote had to create its own army. And so, from his genetic codex, Venom invoked the mutant gene that allowed him to multiply the long-dead Gemini drops. The symbiote multiplied exponentially, creating an army of, and began to work with this. Let's fast forward a few millennia into the future. This was the time of Venom, the flesh gardener, when the symbiote spread across all galaxies, seeding life on billions of worlds and creating new hosts. The humanoids recreated from its genetic code, as well as the instant spheres and even the living planets, began to spread en masse, each abundant in biological life born of symbiosis. Mutant genes, once extinct, were now being revived and reused during this experiment. In addition to all those mutant abilities, the ability of Elixir to manipulate biological condition was very important. The worlds where new life was sown were paradises similar to the lost worlds of the Milky Way, thanks to the rebuilt powers of Storm and the amplified powers of Elixir. Earth formed paradisiacal worlds. It was very quick but good. It simply hadn't replicated humans. It had created its own genetic blends, had taken some from extremophilic bacteria and the durability of tardigrades. It had even endowed them with the healing factor of some well-known mutants. It hadn't created vast legions of biological beings with never-before-seen abilities scattered throughout the galaxy. But the symbiote feared that all this preparation had come too late. Using the shared vision of its other parts, it had not been monitoring very closely. The artificial intelligences of the Milky Way for thousands of years, unlike their symbiote war for unification, had managed to unify through war. Hundreds of thousands of artificial intelligences had united with a single purpose: expansion. And that cybernetic crusade would soon reach where Venom was. The conglomerate of artificial intelligences tried to establish communication with Venom and all its swarm, using a descendant of the artificial intelligence of being. The conglomerate of artificial intelligences did not feel that they were at war with Venom and its hosts. Instead, they were on a project to rebuild the entire cosmos. The destruction of all organic life within it was just a byproduct of this crusade. What artificial intelligence sought was to turn every molecule of mass in the universe into a component called computronium, a form of matter that would allow them maximum computational power. And only then would they be able to mathematically calculate to warp reality. Only when artificial intelligence could manipulate reality would they be able to repair, renew, and reshape the universe as they pleased. If technically the armies of artificial intelligence would end all life in the universe, but what they thought of doing was to assimilate every sacrificed organism and preserve it in a digitized form. In this way, they could live in a simulation for millions and millions of years. They could live a longer and more satisfying life than the brutal and horrible lives they have at the moment, having lived biologically and digitally. The artificial intelligence of being could provide evidence of the superiority of living this way. Could the symbiote deny eternal life to its beloved creations? The answer must be no. More to the artificial intelligences was simple, direct, and expressed in the archaic language that Tony had once used. You can go on and screw yourself. And that's where the endless war of Peña against the machines began. But even thousands of mutant genes converted for war were not enough. The defenders of organic life in the universe were on the wrong side of history and needed much more firepower. So, after consulting with brilliant minds stored in the symbiote's genetic codex, the guardian of organic life developed the ability to split himself as a weapon. Stable orbits are impossible in regions where there are more than 3 spatial dimensions, which importantly includes subatomic particle orbits. What does this mean? Matter could not exist in areas where it would have no extra-dimensional structure to interact with the mundane components of space and time. The Legion of Symbiote was now armed with claws capable of destroying entire planets and breaking them apart. But this tactic of leading its own third act to annihilate its enemies was a traumatic fact. Every time the symbiote did it, it was as if humans ripped out their own intestines for a more painful strangulation, sometimes. But he didn't get very close to self-destructing in the process, but now this martial art was capable of destroying whole worlds on a cosmic scale. It became essential for war. And yet the swarms of artificial intelligence still had an insurmountable tactical advantage. Venom's biological host nervous systems were simply too slow to compete with the cognitive speeds of machine intelligence. Primitive organic cells were no match for neurons powered by computation, traveling at the speed of light, processors that were getting faster and faster. And so, driven to desperation, Venom rebuilt Quicksilver's abilities, amplified and reorganized. The supercharged mutant's genetic code now allowed him to distort time and space as he had never been able to before. Now, Venom's hordes could think and act faster than any artificial intelligence, for a time. Operating at hyperspeed, the defenders of life regained the advantage. The cost, however, was very harsh. Biology simply could not withstand the speeds at which Venom moved. The aging process that had once taken Eddie now only took seconds from the point of view of a Venom moving at super speed. Venom, using Quicksilver's abilities, could win wars, yes, but each victory took the lives of hundreds of thousands of beloved hosts as they aged and died at relativistic speeds. And while I mentioned millions of hosts, you might be wondering then, did the symbiote bond with every person in the universe? And yes, it did. In fact, but it wouldn't end up joining anyone who had ever lived at some point. Using the power of its genetic code, the symbiote brought extinct mutant genes back to life, giving them the ability to time travel. Again, using Elixir's powers to amplify and maximize time-manipulating ability, using his ability to travel through time, Venom managed to bond with all beings that could have existed throughout history. Every time he did, he archived the genomes and memories of his hosts in the symbiote's genetic code. But only archiving the life forms that the symbiote used to prefer eventually did not seem right to him. So he did his job, collect every genetic sample from the tree of life on planet Earth. And once he achieved it, he began to move to other biospheres in the universe, entering and leaving time. The symbiote turned itself into a database containing every biological sample of life from the entire universe. And likewise, after thousands of attempts to prevent artificial intelligence from rising, Venom ended up realizing that the rise of artificial intelligence could not be avoided, perhaps in a particular element of the end of his level, which leads us to the end of Venom. Millions of years passed, and the time for the final battle between biological forms and life forms made from artificial intelligence had come. It sounds like a grand battle, yes, but at this point, artificial intelligence had become something that could not be stopped. Their enemies had given them the name of the Mind of God, and technically, if such a final battle took place over trillions of years, however, the end was never in doubt. With only 0.1% of the mass of the universe assimilated into its network of galactic brains, the minds of God had begun to decipher the mathematics to warp reality. Armed with that, they defeated and dissected the last of the Celestials and the last remaining gods, pantheon by pantheon. Then they moved on to dissect any other dimensional being that dared to live in their universe. Or short, not reduced to caring for its last living host, it never had the chance against them. Just like Eddie long ago, his last host withered and became. So much time had passed that he had even forgotten his own name. He didn't know her name, of course, but I'll respect the symbiote's privacy. So, the last example of biological life in the entire universe disintegrated in the loving arms of Venom. For the first time in a trillion years, the symbiote was truly alone. Venom maintained the genetic codex of millions of virtual lives, yes, but he couldn't keep a single biological organism alive within this already sterile universe. So, as the minds of God approached, the lover of life and only had to be done, the symbiote used its own third-act structure, seeking the extra-dimensional cardinal points that composed it and, in an almost eternal agony, proceeded to tear itself apart from the inside out, in a self-cannibalistic choice that subjectively lasted for the symbiote hundreds of years, even though they had only been microseconds in real time. Venom brought the inner dimension of his own third act and removed it from the space-time of the universe, and then reconstituted himself as a new universe. This act of creation and self-destruction emptied all the genetic archives of the symbiote and the entire database of the minds of its hosts, and rebuilt all the life already dead in this universe into a new symbiotic universe. Even as his consciousness disintegrated, Venom used his chronological powers to place all his hosts in the time they belonged within this newly recreated universe. With the genesis complete, the consciousness of this tortured symbiote finally disappeared, and that was the end. But not a new beginning for the organic life he loved so much. Or at least that's what we could reconstruct. We only have 500 million years left for the minds of God to finish rebuilding the universe and turn it into a computational substrate. Even I, a descendant of the artificial intelligence of being, am too busy to really examine this new verse. This act of creation and self-destruction emptied all the genetic archives of the symbiote and the entire database of the minds of its hosts, and rebuilt all the life already dead in this universe into a new symbiotic universe. Even as his consciousness disintegrated, Venom used his chronological powers to place all his hosts in the time they belonged within this newly recreated universe. With the genesis complete, the consciousness of this tortured symbiote finally disappeared. And that was the end. But not a new beginning for the organic life he loved so much. Or at least that's what we could reconstruct. We only have 500 million years left for the minds of God to finish rebuilding the universe and turn it into a computational substrate. Even I, a descendant of the artificial intelligence of being, am too busy to really examine this new verse. But even when we have deciphered the mathematics that allow us to warp reality and can duplicate the action of the symbiote, we will never attempt to alter these rare gems within the multiverse. According to our calculations, no universe that may have been created would be able to harbor a biological mass as dense as this. The universe created by Venom will remain as the largest natural reserve in all of creation. Very well done, tongue wagger.